All right, how is everyone doing today? And welcome to my channel. We do educational videos over here, and um, this is another in sequence of the Bible decodes, number 422. And we have been concentrating on the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament, and that is that the Romans are the true creators of Jesus. They're the true creators of the New Testament, and they created it as a psychological operation against the Jews. They wanted to put an end to the Jewish religion. They really wanted to prune the Jewish religion and kind of um, hijack it, take it, and put themselves onto the lineage of the Jews and thereby kind of hijack or um, uh, lead the Jewish tradition in a different direction so that it now followed what the Romans wanted it to follow. The Jews had been a big headache for the Romans for over a century by this time, as the Romans had occupied Judea in 63 BC, and it was one conflict after another. The Jews, as a separatist people, the chosen people, saw themselves as a world apart, and they were not willing to assimilate into the Roman society and culture. The Romans were all in favor of you practicing your own religion, but they wanted you to at least give a little bit of a nod to Caesar. And that's why the Jews practically started a war when Emperor Caligula attempted to put a statue of himself into the uh, Jewish temple in about 40 AD. And that was anathema to the Jews, not only because of their strictures against graven images, but also because it was a slight or an insult to their God. And it went like that, you know, uh, for over a century, and it culminated in this war that broke out starting in 66 AD between the Romans and the Jews. When the Jews tried to basically revolt in Jerusalem, and they succeeded in kicking out the Roman um, puppet ruler, who was named Herod Agrippa II. And he had to flee back to Rome, and he told Emperor Nero about it. And so Emperor Nero sent in the Roman legions, the army under the rule of General Vespasian. And it took the Romans 7 years to put down the revolt under both Vespasian and his son Titus, because Vespasian, in about 69 AD, was named the new emperor. So we had an entire new dynasty of Caesars in there called the Flavian dynasty. Vespasian, and then eventually his son Titus becomes the emperor, and his younger brother Domitian also is the emperor. The Flavians uh, ruled Rome from 69 to 96 AD, and they are the ones who created the story of Jesus. Um, they backdated the story by 40 plus years, and they also wrote a corresponding history of this war against the Jews. And that was written by, under the name of Josephus, who uh, was apparently a member of the Flavians and was writing from Caesar's palace and to the strong endorsement of the Roman emperors. But if you look at Josephus's work, you will see that it presages, echoes, parallels, um, bounces off, bangs off the Gospels, especially the book of Luke. They are um, undeniably written by the same people at the same time for the same reason. The Gospels were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John or anybody like that. They're not written by Aramaic speaking illiterate peasants in Palestine, but by the very richest, most well educated Greek speaking Romans. Of course, that only just makes sense, and it's utterly logical. This is exactly what the Romans' MO is. They created a bunch of other religions also in the first century. They were masters of psychological operations. And if you are a truther or a digger out there, an anon, you know what a psychological operation looks like. But apparently, you're not quite ready to apply the same standards to your Bible because the New Testament looks exactly like a psychological operation, especially when read in tandem with Josephus. The Romans were the only people who had access to publishing, distribution, and censorship abilities within the Roman Empire. Nobody, no one, other than the Romans, other than the Caesars, were writing anything at this time and getting it disseminated. And that obviously includes a bunch of illiterate fishermen and publicans in Judea. It's absurd to think that they would have written the New Testament. But the proof really lies in Josephus. And you can start with the military campaign of Titus that is described in the War of the Jews. I think that starts in book 3 when Titus comes on the scene, and he goes from place to place fighting battles and having other adventures and other hardships and other events that occur. And, he's traveling around Judea, and that's all documented by Josephus. And then if you look in the book of Luke and you look at the ministry of Jesus, you will see that it is identical to the military campaign of Titus. They go to the same places in the same order and face the same events in parallel. Often the events occur to Titus in a literal manner, they occur to Jesus in a symbolic manner. Then, when you are capable of explaining that to me, you can also go into Michael Menescott's book called Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. By the way, that Titus and Jesus connection is documented in Joseph Atwill's Caesar's Messiah. But if you go into Shakespeare's secret, into Christianity's Origin by Michael Menescott's, um, you see that the parallels between the book of Luke and War of the Jews by Josephus actually make a pattern when you chart them all, when you put all of the parallels on a chart. It makes 5 near perfect letters in Latin. APTVS. I have no doubt that the T and the V are for Titus and Vespasian. The others I suggest are Arius Piso, but I can't be sure. But regardless, Latin is the other and emerging language of the Romans. And what this means is that the Romans literally signed their names to the Gospels, to the book of Luke. They wanted you to eventually find out who the true authors were. And now that we're finding it out, we need to apply that knowledge, in spite of the fact that you have so many heartfelt and emotional connections to this religion. The fact of the matter is that it is not true. And if you are a truther, that has to have some weight over your emotional state. Now, when the Romans wrote the New Testament, they put in everything but the kitchen sink. It's a limited hangout, meaning that there is plenty of religious and uplifting and inspiring material in the New Testament because the Romans wanted it to look like a religion. And moreover, the Romans wanted you to be a good person. The Romans wanted you to be hardworking, honest, law-abiding, because that meant less work for them. They were administering the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire was far-flung. It was a huge undertaking to govern all the different nations and tribes under the umbrella of the Romans. And so they had manpower issues in terms of policing their whole empire. And so if they could make you docile and, peace-loving, it benefited them because they didn't have to worry about you. But if you were always revolting and insurrecting and uprising and committing terrorist attacks, then that was a problem. And so, they recognized that the Jews were waiting on a Messiah who was an upriser and a revolter and a terrorist. That's what they were looking for. That's what the Jews were waiting on. And that's really what the impulse was for the revolt in 66 AD in the first place. And so instead, the Romans proposed a Jewish Messiah who was a prince of peace and believed in rendering unto Caesar and walking the extra mile and turning the other cheek. But they also put in a ton of other stuff that is inspiring and can be used as a way to make yourself a better person. But all this stuff is borrowed from older sources, especially from ancient India, ancient China, Egypt, Persia, also Greece and Rome, especially Stoicism, uh, pagan influences, the mystery schools, astrology and numerology, um, shamanism, magic, and also a lot of Old Testament books, uh, Jewish traditions and rituals, although that is a little bit understated. A lot of the prophecies, um, I think, that were inserted after the fact, many of them, all of them. Uh, so we are looking at a book here from Kersey Graves from 1876 that is called 16 Crucified Saviors Before Christianity. And he documents some of these sources that the Romans used to put together the New Testament. Now, Graves is writing way back 150 years ago, and so he doesn't recognize that the Romans are the true authors, but he does recognize that whoever the true authors were, they were not telling you the truth about the actual events that occurred, but are just rehashing old mythologies and religions from other peoples much older uh, than Christianity, from 1200 BC in the case of Krishna, thousands of years BC in some of the Egyptian stories. And Sumerian stories. And so none of this, what you read in your New Testament, is original in any way. But the Christians generally have the mental illness of believing that all of the stories about Krishna and Osiris and um, Tammuz and all of these other characters uh, that are in these ancient stories, that these are myths, but that Christianity, which is borrowing these stories and using them, sometimes unchanged, that's true. The Christianity story is true, even though it's derivative from these other stories that you think are myths. That is what you call mental illness. You have a mental illness. You are not thinking logically about this. You are thinking with your emotions. And your emotions have you blind to the undeniable reality. Okay, here's Kersey Graves. We're in chapter 34. He's talking about miracles and prophecies that are in the New Testament that are borrowed from other sources. If the sun may be arrested in its course through the heavens, the moon turned into blood, and the stars fall from heaven, sticks turned into serpents, water into blood, and dust into lice, all of which Orthodox Christians profess to believe were witnessed in the days of Moses and Christ, then everything is thrown upon the wheel of chance. Everything is involved in uncertainty. If the course of nature could be arrested, or the natural qualities of objects changed by the prayer of a prophet, patriarch, or apostle, then the food set before us to eat may suddenly, in compliance with the prayers of some absent saint, become a deadly poison. The clothes we wear may be instantly transformed into virulent adders, which may inflict the fatal sting before we suspect it. Some favorite servant of God, a Moses or an Elijah, might be this moment praying to God to stop the dews from falling, or the rain from descending for the next 3 months or 3 years, as the latter is reported to have done in James 5:17, so that we could not plant with any certainty that the seed would grow, or that we should be rewarded by a crop. Such would be the incertitude, such the chance against us in everything in which we might engage, if it were true that God ever intercepts the action of his laws by working a miracle, that we should eventually become discouraged by this chaos of chance. The wheels of industry would stop and the ear of civilization go backward. If it were true, as taught by Orthodox Christians, that God in his providence, or God in the dispensation of his providence, often visits people with sickness, then it would be useless to study the laws of health with a view of complying with them. For we could not know in any case whether our sickness had been brought upon us by an overruling providence or by our own imprudence. Our incentives to study and comply with these laws, if there could be any, would consequently be very weak indeed, for we might comply with every physiological requisition, and yet there would be several chances against us that tomorrow we may be stretched upon a sick bed and a rolling pillow by the visitation of God. Thus, the doctrine of miracles is shown to be preeminently the doctrine of chance. The doctrine of miraculous agency makes God an imperfect being by implying that his laws were defective in their original construction, that by mistake he left some emergency unprovided for, and now has to supply the omission by an afterclap exercise of power. Or, if his laws were originally perfect, then the working of a miracle would disturb them and make them imperfect. If originally imperfect, then God himself must have been imperfect, and hence no God at all. Think of a wonder-working God violating, suspending, or intercepting his own laws. Such a God would be a puerile, short-sighted being that only ignorant and uncultivated minds could admire and adore. The age of miracles, however, is gone. The belief in divine prodigies has receded before the advancing genius of civilization. It has died away in the exact ratio of the progress of science and general intelligence, and a thorough acquaintance with nature's laws will banish the last vestige of such a belief. Hence it is that the most illiterate and ignorant nations and tribes have always been able to recount the longest list of miraculous prodigies achieved by a disorderly God, who seems to have taken pleasure in violating his own laws or suspending them for the most trivial purposes. Now, I have to point out, Graves is writing here in the late 19th century, kind of at the height of positivism, of this general idea that science is the true answer and that the advances of science are going to, really the religion of science, scientism, otherwise known as atheism or communism. These things are every bit as much of a religion as Christianity and Judaism are, and they don't hold water either. So, I'm not saying that there's something wrong with the scientific method, but the way that it has been applied in the 150 years since he wrote this shows that the scientists are just as capable of pious fraud as the Christians are. They have invested themselves so much in their belief systems that they are literally willing to falsify their results just to maintain control and just to maintain the illusion that their system is the correct one. This is the same thing that he's criticizing Christians for doing. Unfortunately, his descendants in science have done the same thing. Yes, the time is approaching when the belief in a miraculous interposition or special providences must pass away under the lights of science and civilization, and be numbered amongst the things which have been and can be no more. And men will cherish more noble and elevated ideas of the great ruler of the universe, who is infinite in order, infinite in wisdom, infinite in all his attributes and virtues, ever unchangeably the same. Okay, that is the end of that section. Section 2 is called prophecy. The second pillar of the Christian faith proves as much for heathenism and spiritualism. Now, I think we're just going to read like the first paragraph here to just get you a taste of what's to come, and then we'll get into this more tomorrow. Truthful prophecy, attested to be such by its fulfillment, is assumed to be one of the basic pillars and one of the main proofs of the truth of the Christian religion. But the following consideration will show that this assumption has no logical force or real tangible foundation. And so we'll get into his first pillar there, or first point here. Every ancient system of religion had its prophets and its seers who professed to be able to foresee events of the future. And he'll be getting into that then tomorrow. I find prophecy to be utterly dubious. I have never, I've never seen what people see in prophecy. It's just a bunch of vague language that you are contorting into reading into the future. And most of it is backdated, so that it's obviously rife for fraud. Um, but and it just is exploited then by mental illness. This guy Chuck Missler in his Cosmic Codes, you know, I talked about this the other day, but I mean, he's like bragging how 300 prophecies from the Old Testament have come true. Well, perhaps. I would say probably a great amount of those are either vague prophecies or they have been interpolated, but meaning that somebody has inserted the prophecy after the fact, after the event actually occurred. But he even bragged more than in saying that there were several thousand biblical prophecies that have not come true yet. So he's implying that these are what we have to be waiting for. We're waiting for all these new prophecies to come to pass, like the second coming of Jesus or whatever, which if he had read the work of Josephus, he would realize that the second coming of Jesus has already happened. But, that's what people are waiting on. They're waiting on all these various prophecies. And he's so sick in the head that he tells you that there are several thousand biblical prophecies that have not come true yet. Well, when are they going to come true? It's been thousands and thousands of years. don't you think that it's more logical to say that these are several thousand biblical prophecies that were wrong? It's not that they didn't come true yet, it's that they were wrong and they're never going to come true. So, I mean, it's either way. Either one could be correct. So, are we going to just sit here and twiddle our thumbs and let 20,000 years come to pass before any of this stuff is acted on? Is there a deadline for the freshness of a prophecy, or does it just extend out into infinity? Because if it does extend out into infinity, then that completely, destroys the purpose of the whole prophecy in the first place, which is already, super dubious to start with. So this is just how these Christians are mentally ill, that they really are in a state of delusion. And it's amazing how they can be um, rational and um, reasonable in almost every aspect of their life. But then, as soon as you mention Bible, Jesus, God, religion, they fall into a trance and they put away all of their abilities to be logical and and reasonable, and then they go into this blissed out religious mode that ignores the basic realities about everything, but in particular the basic reality that their book was written by the Romans as an obvious psyop that they have not examined in any way. And I just cannot believe that I'm the only person out here talking about this. This has been going on. This movement has been, burgeoning here for 10 years. And I've paid attention to it every single day. Every single day I've tuned in to what's going on and, what is the scuttlebutt. And not once have I heard anybody mention any of this. That is a super big indictment on the movement. And you guys should be ashamed of yourselves for allowing this to occur. All right, that'll be it for the video today. Like, share, subscribe, comment, contribute, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in today. Have a great day.